What is going on, guys? D1 here, and today I'm going to show you guys how to make directional movement using Python, or axis movement. The movement system that I'm going to show you how to do is basically where you can press, say, WASD or arrow keys, whichever you prefer. Press, for example, forward to go forward on the x-axis, and then downwards, or S to go down. And of course you have the back and forth movement on the x-axis, which would work for 2D games, by the way. And of course you would have the combined axis movement, where you're moving at the y and x-axis depending on which buttons you press, the combination of buttons. So there's a very simple setup for this. The first object we're going to have is the control cube, which will actually move on the axes we specify. Then there's going to be a second object inside the control cube, which is parented to the control cube, and that's going to be the player's mesh. It's going to represent the player. So if you have an animated character, you would fit it in there, in place of the object that we're going to have inside that we're just going to call the player, to make it easier to understand. And this player object is the one that's going to be turning to face those directions. So the control cube moves, the player object rotates to face the direction, to show the player where he's moving. And of course there's going to be a camera parented behind it. So we're just going to put the camera in its place right now. I just did Control R, Control G to reset the movement, the rotation and the position. We want to go into game before we do anything. And let's just make this a camera view, just so we see where we're facing. Where's the 3D view? There we go. This is just so we see what our camera's looking at the moment. Camera right there. And I'm going to move it back, rotate it on the x-axis, and move it on the local z-axis by double tapping Z. G, Z, and then Z again for the local movement. And I'm going to scale this down, select the control cube, which we're going to name control cube soon, hit tab to go into edit mode, and then S for scale 0.5. And this makes it smaller, so it looks a lot nicer on our camera. And now we're gonna parent the camera to the cube. Well, actually, before we parent, let's name the cube control cube. Now, for the camera, we don't want it when the control cube isn't gonna rotate, so it shouldn't be an issue. So we could just parent it normally. We don't need a vertex parent for it. So we select the camera first, and then the control cube, Control P. The last object you select always becomes the parent. So now when we move the cube, the camera moves with it. Perfect. And now what we're going to do is we're going to have a second cube inside it. But before we do that, we want to make our cube sort of more transparent so we can see the object inside of it. So what I'll do is I'll make it an outline, a wireframe. So we're going to go here into the object section in the properties panel. Scroll down, and in display, check wire. Actually, not wire, in type, change it to wire. This one just adds, say it's set to solid, it just adds the wire to it, so you can see it there. But we don't want that, we want it to be completely wireframe. So now we don't see solid faces, we see a wireframe. Now in-game, let's go to textured mode, hit P, you can see that it's still solid. And that's a problem, so to fix that, we're going to have to add a special material to it. Basically, you start off with a default material. Set it to, I like to set it to red. And what I'll do is I'll set it to shadeless so that it's not affected by shading, and then wire. The reason why I set it to shadeless is if I run it now, you can see the shading makes some lines black. We want it to be uniform so it's more distinguished. And now when we hit P, we see the red square there. So that's going to be our control cube. This is for debugging purposes. In the final game, of course, or in a preview of the game, you want to set it to invisible, so that you no longer see it, but you want to see it in terms of debugging in case you have a problem. So now we'll add the internal player object. Actually cube. You want to add a cube, using space of course to add. Scale it down to 0.5 to match the control cube. And then what I'll do is I'll hit tab to go into edit mode. Now this is the x-axis here. We're going to make a loop cut on the x-axis. And the loop cut is basically it adds a cut all around. And you're going to see what we're going to do with it. Control R to make a loop cut. Left click, and then it's going to move with the mouse. I'm just going to right click to reset it to center. And then I'll grab these vertices, which are at the front. If you notice here towards the y-axis, I'm just going to grab these vertices to select the full front face, and then W, merge at center. And this makes it pointy, so we can see where it's pointing when we rotate it. If it's a cube, obviously it's going to be hard to distinguish. So what's going to happen is this object is going to move on the axes. This object is going to rotate to show us where we're moving, or the direction that we're pointing at. And we're going to give it a material and a color. We have to name it first, of course. So in the object section, we're going to call it player. And materials, we're going to add a material, call it player, just to make it more distinguished. And I'm going to set it to orange. And now when I hit P, I can see my player there. No problem. He's kind of reddish, but that's not a big deal. We can make him more yellow. There we go. So now we can see our player object. We're going to remove the speck, just so there's only shading. There you go. That's going to be our character. So now that we can see him through the cube, you can see here we can see the outline, the red outline, and then we can also see the player. So in terms of display, our character is set up. Now we're going to have to create empties around the character to specify the axes. So when I want to make the character turn to face a particular direction, you can make him move in a particular direction using normal movement, the motion actuator, for example. Now we're going to be using Python for this tutorial, but you know how to make directional movement. What about facing a particular direction? Well, you can probably come up with something complicated with Python to simulate that, but the simplest way is to add a bunch of empties. So I'm going to add one empty, move it forward a set number of units. So I'm going to move it forward 1 on the y-axis and see how that looks. Yeah, it looks about right. And I'm going to change its shape here. If you click on this icon here, it should be object data. Yeah. This is the display of the empty, what it looks like in the engine. Obviously, empties don't show up in-game, but you want them to look like something that, you know, it's supposed to represent what it does. So I'm going to make it a cone, so it points towards its direction. And I'm going to set it to 0.5 in terms of size, so it's not so big. It's a little bit too distant. That shouldn't be a problem, though. I think that's fine. So this is going to be our empty. I'm just going to go and set it to a ghost, so it doesn't cause any problems. And name it. We're going to have to name them, by the way, because we're going to need the names later on. I'm going to name this forward, or point forward. And then I'm going to create a second empty. This time move it -1 units on the y-axis. And that's going to be the back empty. And I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees and apply rotation object. Okay, so now we have our back pointer set up. We just have to name it back pointer. And we're going to duplicate it. Shift D, rotate it roughly 90 degrees. Or let's do this. Let's not duplicate it. I deleted my duplicates. I'm going to duplicate this front pointer. Set its position to 0 on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we want it to be 1. And then we want it set to 90 degrees rotation. Okay, -90 degrees rotation. Alright, and I'll duplicate this again and move it on the negative, set it to -1 on the x-axis, and set it to 90 degrees rotation. And now this is going to be, of course, y is pointing forward, positive x is pointing to the right, so we're going to call this point right, and then point left. Now we're also going to allow the player to combine two axes. So if he's moving forward and right, it would move him on an angle. And this wouldn't normally be an issue, because if you're using apply movement forward and then apply movement right, it's going to move on an angle. That's no problem. The problem comes when we want our object to rotate to that direction. So in that case, we're going to have to duplicate these, create basically 4 more, just for the angling, just so that the player can point in those directions. So I duplicated all 4. RZ to rotate on the Z-axis, and I'm just looking at my rotation here. I want